So I'm going to talk today about life in the information state. And I guess while I'm setting this up, you have to know that I emerged out of complete and utter chaos. Meaning there was no location, it was dislocation. There was no support, it was unsupportive. There was no redundant system, there was complete and utter sympathetic nervous system in shock. And that was because of my home life. But before I get there, this talk is not going to be about data and cookies and privacy and security, not that type of information that we think that we know of why I'm up here today. I'm going to talk about the different tiers of how society is formed and how we start having these structured. And as I was digging into them, it really became about these layers, 7 layers of the truest levels of known information, identity, security, and how hygiene and tradition is passed down between time. But it was really weird because before I could start deconstructing this puzzle of layers and society and tradition and things that I held and what we as humans all know, the chaos isn't just mine, and how I perform and make matzo ball soup wasn't just mine, it was something we passed down. I had to see that this upbringing, it was a simulated system, an airline of this life that I had got on that was completely in crash. And this plane crash of my life kept happening. And so what happens with a plane crash, sometimes after the recovery of a complete disaster, there's a black box. And maybe you can get some information from this black box and see what was going on this flight, what happened. And for me at least, and I don't know about you guys, it seemed that every single layer of my life was a complete and utter plane crash disaster. School, home life, my sympathetic nervous system wasn't mine. My redundant system was the security of my mother. And as a small child, every belief I had was to save her, never me. So what's this person? Well, this is the same person. This is about 3.5 years ago. Someone who was translating culture very different ways. It was one about how is communication the key to survival? And in this life that I was living, this life of food and sustenance and cultural pass down and high technologies up through the national order and then down from a familial level, there was this fluidity of learning what it was that we were preserving and protecting. And there was these different devices through each one. But both of these people still was going through a plane crash of self constantly. And I didn't know what this system that I held, this information, these values, the way that my brain was running this flight simulation of what it should be, and this experience of life all of a sudden changed. So those two people started to see that to have an experience, culture, one needed to be immersed in the things that begin to define it in order to build a sustainable community around it. Community absolutely happened to be this pass down of traditions. What were we preserving? What was important? What was the run system that was overriding other systems? And for me as a translator, getting inside of the box in order to go beyond it was really important, and that's how you found like that person, eating calzots and designing food, and then working with military and communication satellite systems up in space. So going back to a black box, in Silicon Valley, and maybe some of you guys know, it's like, there's 2 different black boxes. There's a West Coast island, there's an East Coast island. Maybe sometimes you can see this input. There's like this scrambled eggs effect that happens, and then this output of magical omelet, and you're like, how did you get there? And then sometimes you can go inside of that flight box, as you saw before the plane crash disaster, and start looking at the pieces. So I started to say, okay, so I'm going through I was not surviving. So going through my black box of self, what were the different elements and the facets of myself? And how do we humans start processing information and start running different things? How do we store our memories? How do we run different simulations? How do we choose a flight path? How do we learn all of these things? So suddenly all of this time around the intelligence community started showing me that I could start breaking up my information just like this flight simulator box, and I didn't have to be a black box anymore because of these 2 different elements of translation of self. I was totally and constantly processing all of this multiculturalism that I had because in school I was removed from classes, and at home I was told I couldn't survive. So I never learned how to exchange information. I only learned how to absorb it. So I started deconstructing my layers because, again, I told you I wasn't surviving. This plane crash was a sustenance of self, and there was maybe an exterior that you can see, but it was worse than damage control. It was complete and utter death. So I did something interesting after this. Person from like a national leader of analytics, it doesn't even matter. He was like, Sloane, we need to clone you. How do you work? And I was like, I have no idea. So there were some programs running in my brain from New York City as I had left a corporate job, and it was really abusive, and it was exactly the same patterns of my home life and this abuse and removal from school that I had had. And I knew I wanted the highest level of respect, so I did something weird. I started working with babies. I didn't know myself. I didn't know my personality developed. I didn't know the love that all of us in this room maybe at one point or another have felt. This touch and bond and pass down and privacy and preservation and security and this embedded system of complete nervous system bigger than myself. And I learned it through vetting 45 families and finding 5 kids here in this city hiding from pitching and national security and everything else to find out who I was and where the fact of whatever I bring into my arms has complete ripple effects outward. So I listened to this smart man who was building these intelligent systems for the nation and the globe, and I was looking at these babies and I started unpacking the system and the operating system of me. And it was so wild because growing up and you're taught like you're so dumb or you don't belong in these classes and your life is no bigger than your parents, especially if you're taking care of them. And if you're going through crashes of yourself, you're gonna start wondering what's inside of my black box. So I opened up my hood to find out all of my processing systems. And then it became less about me. It was actually every single human was the most diverse thing on this planet because of the way that we looked outward and how we multi-processed our information and flew through our lives with all of these layers. It wasn't just like that I spoke a bunch of languages and I felt Spanish or I felt French or I was doing all of these things through these different lenses. It was much bigger. It was a flattening of humanity. And the most human thing we can have in this 21st century is actually understanding our relationship with the information systems and our humanity and our machines. So all of this tanglement started looking like this. It was like, okay, there's certain things that are consistent. All of a sudden I could label myself, and then I started saying that I was no longer an operative embedding myself in these cultures to make deductions that I had absolutely no idea about. It was about being an operator and participating with humanity to start understanding things. So that's me as a 16-year-old starting the robotics team in high school, which is really super fun. But what was even cooler was learning about the experience of life through having our Imagineers, and I got to go behind the scenes at Disneyland. And this ride of life all of a sudden was like, whoa, this is something we get on and go. Until I got to have the perks of the thing, which was going and walking behind. So then we got to go to Indiana Jones, and I started seeing a redundant system for the first time, which was like all of the security was embedded, every shock, every value, every experience. And I was like, what is the program that I'm running? Well, in this game of life, I went back to my family and I was like, what do you need to know how to survive? So I went back to all these places, and all these guys had all of these things embedded to have all this information flowing to keep and preserve these systems of movement of people. So you could start looking and breaking it down as like a belief system. There was all this rules of law embedded, and then there was cultures and traditions that went back in each of these tiers, and people knew who they were, and the shock value of each system of going through these things were there. But I started to think about like being from California. I don't know if any of you guys are also from California. We grew up with like earthquake preparedness, which is a natural disaster. It has absolutely nothing to do with critical infrastructure of like a credit system, of learning about how to get a home loan. And these basic things of this ride of life, not just the experience, like you really needed to learn. And all of a sudden preparedness happened to be something more far-fetched, just like how my mother overrode my system. I was learning how to participate in the world with absolutely no effect. So this checklist of self was like, okay, what readiness do I have? So every system started having all of these procedures that were utilizing information more intensely to process and control and make structure for participation for the many. And we learned about it. But I was like, oh God, there's a whole system of just being able to be myself and learning about money and learning about business and learning about infrastructure beyond being able to go to a library and learn, or go to school and learn, or go to a religious center and learn. It was cataclysmically disastrous just because also the place I learned all these things never learned them and they never taught me. So when we start looking at connected devices and that this information flow is exorbitant, we can see that these places that used to have this critical infrastructure, this planning, these security systems, these redundant systems, just like at the Indiana Jones ride, like our city planners, our developers, our nations, our religious centers, they all had this path of security embedded in hygiene. And all of a sudden, with all these connected devices and information, we were getting lost, just like I had been. It was mental exhaustion and overstimulation, over-information, and I didn't know how to process through all of my data until I started asking these questions of why I was there in the first place. So life starts getting really crazy and exponential in this world right now because all the devices are beyond any of these classical 20th and prior centuries of keeping things in order. We can learn so much more now, and then this ride of life that we had, this experience of life that we knew, this way that we could set things up, all of a sudden became so uncertain because of so many different information flows, and we were getting lost because there was no baseline of where and how security was going to be reorganized in all of this information that had no identity to begin with. It was just a lot. So in the time of exorbitant data collection, we can start flushing what we know of this game of life down the drain, and we can start saying that we need to look at how decentralization is playing into the modern day life. What is, for instance, back into critical infrastructure, what are licenses of something that we hold, of rule sets that used to be embedded in these systems, these processes, these organizations of how we flowed in and out of everyday life, and we can start learning about what actually our accountability of holding a rule set is before we go and do something. So I did a really interesting experiment with driving for Uber. It's a totally different day, but I started learning that there was a couple different things happening in this. It wasn't that I just held a driver's license and I had a portal of a map that was telling me how to get around and find somebody, but there was really inconsistency of what the map was telling me to do with my human decision-making power of what I knew was right and safe in the moment and there with common sense, on top of all this data tracking and monitoring and giving reports daily on my performance where I had absolutely no idea on any of these centers of what a score out of 37 of braking and acceleration meant. Like, who made these scores, and were you going to sell my information for real-time analytics as the infrastructure of insurance agencies were changing? So it came back to that girl that was with the military satellite in front of our nation's security people asking, just like I was in this car asking myself, what does all this information mean? I asked these guys, how do I bring someone into the world in a culture that doesn't exist? How do I teach these kids that I'll be bringing in and we will all be bringing in about life, what's going to mean when there's tons of information being measured and collected about them without any intentionality? So as the unpacking of the brain happened and the participation started seeing, and I was asking questions on accountability and measures and metrics and things, it was like, our brains are the most insecure, and yet we're giving everything away. So how do we start living in this world of amounts of information where we don't know? Well, we can start within ourselves to start unpacking. So the rawest form of identity and security in a decentralized state is really our actual intelligence, and that's what AI to me is. So before we go further, it's really a fact check of the self to know these rules that we think we know to go forward. So all this complex technological infrastructure can actually start teaching us about how do we start setting up an identity of an intentionality practice for the 21st century of what we want to shape. We didn't have to be flight risks. We didn't have to get lost in the information. We can start seeing what was at purpose and at bay. So I think that the UN's 17 sustainability goals are actually a really beautiful setup for identity for the 21st century. Just like we have had religion or government systems, it was a really interesting starting place to look at why we need to take things that used to be protected and release them, and see that all of this amazing and distributed systems that we can have all over the world could make a difference if we just had an intentionality behind it. So it wouldn't be a brave new world that we were living in of uncertainty. It would really be one that we had to pave, and just like myself, I've paved my own path by looking at all the information, by going through and under the hood and seeing what we can do. So I look at ROI as, the balance of what an intentionality is versus just investment. And looking at that now is saying, okay, so where do we begin? Thank you.